Did he really say that about his own daughter? That was the line that stopped everyone cold during the latest Special Forces episode. The camera didn't linger on Mykelti's face for long, but you could see the shift, that familiar moment where someone finally stops brushing things off and decides to tell the truth, even if it hits hard, because this time she wasn't holding back. And this time the topic was her dad. Hey friends, welcome back. Today we are diving into what happened when Mykelti ended up on Special Forces and opened up about things fans have wondered about for years. Not the polished TLC version, not the polite family, reunion, style conversation. I'm talking about the raw moment where she confronted the brutal truth about her relationship with Kody Brown. Now we've seen bits and pieces of this build for a while. Mykelti has always tried to defend him in the past, or at least soften the blow. But something about this new environment, the pressure, and the forced honesty of a show like Special Forces brought up emotions she usually keeps tucked away. And honestly, the things she said weren't surprising, they were overdue. The theory that's been floating around for months now is that Mykelti finally reached her limit, not because of one big event, but because she started seeing a pattern she couldn't ignore anymore. A pattern about how her dad treats his kids, especially his daughters, when they stop fitting into the version of family he wants to present to the world. And if you have watched any of the recent seasons of Sister Wives, you already know how deep that pattern runs. So let's talk about what really happened and why this moment matters so much. Why hearing Mykelti talk so openly felt different from the usual commentary. Why this felt less like a television moment and more like someone finally saying the quiet part out loud, because she didn't just talk about her dad being strict or difficult or distracted. She talked about the emotional fallout. She talked about the way he measures loyalty. She talked about favoritism, and she talked about the kind of hurt that doesn't go away on its own. Special Forces are designed to make people break, but for Mykelti, it didn't look like she was breaking. It looked more like she was finally telling the truth without worrying about protecting anyone's image, and that honesty hit harder than anything else on the episode. It started in one of those high-pressure interviews where the producers ask personal questions while you are already exhausted. The kind where people stop giving rehearsed answers because they don't have the energy to pretend. Mykelti was talking about her childhood, the structure of her family, and what it felt like growing up in a house that was always buzzing with tension, even when no one admitted it. She was calm at first, steady. You could tell she'd said pieces of this before. But then one of the instructors asked her a simple question. What is your relationship like with your father now? That is when everything cracked open, not dramatically, not with tears or yelling, but with that quiet honesty people only get to when they've carried something too heavy for too long. She paused. I looked down, took a breath that said more than the words that came after it, and then she said, "It is complicated, and it has been hard for a long time." Nothing dramatic, right? But if you've watched Sister Wives, those two sentences probably say enough on their own. And that's when she started unpacking things she's tried to minimize for years. Things like how she always felt she had to earn his attention. Things like how Kody's love comes with conditions. Things like how he showed up when he wanted to look like a good father, but wasn't around when the kids actually needed him. And then she gave the line that changed the tone of the entire conversation. I stopped expecting anything from him. It was easier that way. The room got quiet. Even the instructor paused. You could tell this wasn't some rehearsed TLC talking point. This was the kind of truth that people usually say in private, not on camera. And she didn't stop there. She started explaining how growing up in a huge family is one thing. But growing up in a huge family where your dad only has time for a few favorites is something entirely different. She talked about how that shaped her, how it shaped her siblings, how some of them learned early to fight for scraps of his attention, while others just gave up and learned to lean on each other instead. This was the first time we saw her acknowledge what so many fans have said for years. Kody's version of being a father depended on which child made him feel important. Not which child needed him, not which child was struggling, not which child deserved stability, just whichever child made him feel powerful. And in that moment, you could almost see Mykelti finally letting herself say it out loud. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just the clarity that comes when someone stops lying to themselves for the sake of keeping the peace. This was the moment that told us the rest of her revelations weren't coming from a place of revenge. They were coming from a place of acceptance, and acceptance is always more powerful than resentment. Once Mykelti opened up, the pieces started connecting fast. You could see it in the way she talked. She wasn't digging for memories or trying to dramatize anything. She was speaking from a place of recognition, almost like she was finally putting a name to something she'd felt her whole life. She said something that caught even the production team off guard. It wasn't one moment, it was the pattern. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That is when she started laying it out, quietly, but with total certainty. The pattern she described wasn't about arguments or disagreements or even the chaos of plural marriage. It was about a behavior that repeated over and over until it became impossible to ignore. Here is how she explained it. When the kids were young, they all thought Kody's attention was something you earned by being fun enough or positive enough, the kind of kid who could keep up with his energy. But as they got older, it became clear that wasn't the truth. The truth was that Kody drifted toward whichever child fed his ego, the ones who made him feel respected, admired, or in control. Mykelti said it in such a calm way, but it hit like a punch. He didn't want relationships. He wanted validation, and that right there was the turning point. She talked about how he lit up around the kids who praised him or who aligned with whatever storyline he wanted to live in at that moment. And that is when she explained the part that stung the most. When you stopped being convenient, you stopped existing to him. That wasn't bitterness. That wasn't anger. That was someone describing a truth they've finally accepted. She went on to say that she first noticed the shift when she became a teenager. She wasn't trying to impress him anymore. She wasn't trying to be the bubbly daughter who kept the mood up. She was growing into her own person, and her world wasn't orbiting around him the way it used to. And that is when his distance began. She talked about missed moments, canceled plans, and how easy it was for him to disappear when he wasn't the center of the story. She said she used to make excuses for it because that's just how things worked in a big family. But as an adult, she realized it wasn't the size of the family at all. It was the way her dad prioritized his own comfort. Then came the moment that really landed. I stopped chasing him, and he never came after me. That sentence says everything. It explains the emotional gap. It explains the favoritism. It explains why so many of the Brown kids have similar stories even though they rarely talk about them publicly. Mykelti wasn't accusing. She wasn't attacking. She was connecting the dots of her own life. And she said the most painful part wasn't losing his attention. It was realizing that he never noticed she was gone. When the instructors pushed her a little deeper, Mykelti hesitated for the first time. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew exactly what was coming next. You could see her debating whether this was the moment she finally said the thing she's avoided for years. Then she let out a quiet laugh, the kind people use when they're covering up pain, and she said, I didn't just lose him. I lost parts of my family because of him. That shifted everything. The instructors leaned in. The production crew stopped moving. Even the other cast members glanced over, realizing she was about to rip open something she'd kept sealed for a long time, and then she explained what she meant. Growing up in a family that big already came with pressure, but growing up in a family where the father's attention created invisible sides, that changed everything. She talked about how the kids weren't divided because they wanted to be. They were divided because they were constantly trying to survive the emotional landscape he created. She said, we learned early on which version of ourselves would get his approval, and we all reacted differently. Some siblings tried to be the perfect kids. Some tried to stay quiet and avoid conflict. Some rebelled, and some, like Mykelti, tried to be strong enough to handle it for everyone else. Then she said something that hit harder than anything she'd said yet. He didn't just split marriages. He split us, not deliberately, not with some master plan, but with the way he made the kids feel like they had to choose between being loyal to him, loyal to their mothers, or loyal to each other. And that choice, even when it was unspoken, shaped the entire dynamic of the Brown household. Mykelti explained how she watched siblings shut down emotionally because they didn't want to compete for his attention. Others became people pleasers to stay on his good side. Some grew resentful when they realized he was more present for certain kids than others, and she admitted she had her own role in that dynamic. I tried so hard to be positive that I didn't notice the damage until we were adults. She talked about how she believed staying optimistic would keep the peace. She thought if she stayed cheerful enough, supportive enough, or adaptable enough, she could hold everyone together. But as she grew older, she realized she wasn't actually solving anything. She was just covering cracks that eventually split wide open. Then came the part she clearly didn't want to say but knew she had to. It took years before I realized the tension between some of us wasn't because of personality differences. It was because we were reacting to the same pain in different ways. This wasn't finger pointing. This wasn't blaming. This was someone finally acknowledging how deep the emotional fallout went. She said that watching the family unravel on camera wasn't even the hardest part. The hardest part was watching her siblings try to navigate their identities outside of the emotional climate Kody created. And the most heartbreaking line was this: some of us didn't talk for years, and it wasn't because we didn't love each other, it was because we didn't know how to separate our relationships from him. That's when it became obvious her story wasn't just about her dad. It was about collateral damage. After she opened up about the family dynamics, Mykelti took a moment, and you could tell she was debating whether to keep going. This was the part she'd always protected, the part she usually smoothed over with humor or quick explanations. But special forces don't give you the luxury of hiding. So when the instructor asked, "When did things change for you personally?" she finally told the story she's kept quiet for years. She said it wasn't a fight. It wasn't a betrayal. It wasn't even something dramatic. It was a small moment, one of those everyday things that shouldn't mean much but ends up revealing everything. It happened after she had her first child. She waited for her dad to call, not a grand gesture, not a big speech, just a simple, "How are you doing?" "How's the baby?" He didn't call. She brushed it off at first. He was busy, he was stressed. He had a lot going on with the family and the show. But then days passed. Then weeks. Finally, she called him. She told him the baby was doing great and that they were settling into everything. And instead of the warmth she hoped for, she got something else entirely. She said he sounded distracted, like he was somewhere else emotionally, like being a grandfather was an obligation, not something he cared about. That moment stuck with her. Not because he didn't show up the way she imagined, but because for the first time she realized he didn't even notice he hadn't shown up. Then she shared the detail that fully changed her perspective. He asked me what day the baby was born. He couldn't remember. That hit her harder than she expected. She wasn't asking him to be perfect. She wasn't asking him to be the world's greatest dad or grandfather. She just wanted him to care enough to remember something important in her life. And that's when it sank in. I realized I cared more about having a relationship with him than he cared about having one with me. She didn't say it with anger. She said it with the kind of resignation that comes when someone finally sees the truth without the filters. She used to defend him whenever anyone questioned his absence. She told her siblings he was trying. She told friends he was overwhelmed. She told herself he loved her even if he wasn't good at showing it. But that phone call cracked something open, because she finally confronted the idea she'd been avoiding for years. If I stopped reaching out, he wouldn't notice. That realization didn't make her hate him. It didn't make her bitter. It just made her stop pretending. She stopped making excuses, stopped carrying the emotional weight, stopped trying to be the one who held the connection together. And she said the most painful part wasn't losing the closeness they used to have. The painful part was realizing that closeness only existed because she'd been doing all the work. After she finished talking about the phone call, Mykelti shifted in her seat. You could see the weight of memory settling in. She said that once she accepted the truth about her relationship with her dad, something unexpected happened. She started remembering things differently, not changing them, not rewriting history, just seeing them through adult eyes instead of the hopeful eyes of a child who wanted her dad to be a certain kind of man. She said, I didn't realize how many moments I reinterpreted just to make them feel better, and then she started explaining how it hit her. She remembered watching him hype up certain kids while barely glancing at others. As a kid, she thought he was just tired or distracted. As an adult, she realized he was only energized when he felt admired. She remembered family nights where he dominated every conversation, and the only way to avoid conflict was to agree with him. Back then, she thought it was funny or quirky. Now she understood it was control. She remembered birthdays he missed, school events he forgot, and milestones he brushed over. But as a kid, she excused it because that is what everyone did. As an adult, she saw the pattern. He showed up when it made him look good. He disappeared when it required effort. Then she talked about one memory that resurfaced with new meaning. She was about 12 when she overheard two of her siblings arguing about who was Dad's favorite. At the time, she laughed it off and told them he loved everyone equally. She believed that, as she spoke about special forces, you could hear the shift in her voice when she said, "Now I understand why they fought about it. We were all trying to figure out what we had to do to matter to him." That realization shook her, not because she blamed her siblings, but because she finally recognized the emotional competition he unintentionally created. She explained that in a family of more than a dozen kids, you expect chaos. You expect noise and shifting alliances and the usual sibling drama, but she said what they experienced was different. It wasn't a normal competition. It wasn't typical jealousy. It was survival. We weren't fighting for toys. We were fighting for attention. And that is when she said something that even surprised the instructors. "I used to think I had a good childhood, and I did in many ways, but the emotional neglect was so normal that I didn't see it until I became a parent myself." Becoming a mother changed everything for her. It made her look back on her own childhood through a different lens. It made her question things she never questioned before. She talked about how she now knows what it feels like to love a child so deeply that you remember every detail without trying. And that is what made her realize just how absent her dad really was. She wasn't angry about it. She wasn't resentful. She was just seeing clearly for the first time. Then she said the line that summed it all up. "I didn't lose my childhood. I just finally understood it." After unpacking her memories and coming to terms with her own perspective, Mykelti described the moment she finally confronted Kody, not on television, not for the cameras, but in a setting where she could speak freely and honestly. She explained that she had rehearsed what she wanted to say countless times for years. She had tried small gestures, small hints, hoping he would notice, hoping he would adjust, but those gestures rarely landed. She realized she could either keep pretending or speak directly. She recalled the conversation. "I told him, I need you to hear this, not as my dad, not as the head of the family, but as the man who raised me. I need you to understand what has been happening." Kody's initial reaction, according to her, was defensive. He tried to explain, justify, and even redirect the focus, the same pattern that had played out for years. He didn't immediately apologize. He didn't immediately understand. But the difference this time was she didn't let him off the hook. She said, "I wasn't looking for excuses. I was seeking acknowledgement, and it is that acknowledgement that shifted the dynamic, even if ever so slightly." She talked of how she didn't need him to be a perfect father. She didn't need him to rewrite the past. She needed for him to acknowledge the impact of his actions, or in some cases, his inaction. She recalled that moment with surprising clarity. "I told him the favoritism, the absence, the way you would drift toward who made you feel powerful. It affected all of us. It shaped how we view relationships, how we trust people, how we expect love." Her words weren't meant to cut him. They were words of understanding, even if the understanding would come much later. And Kody's response, she said, was telling. He listened. He nodded. There were no immediate apologies, but there was one moment when she felt that he heard her. A small, rare window into what might have been if communication had been better all those years. Then came the harder part. Even after all of this, the patterns don't disappear overnight. We're still navigating the gaps he left behind. It wasn't a full resolution. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was an honest acknowledgement of the complexities in a family that has lived under unusual circumstances for decades. She stressed how this conversation wasn't for the cameras, for the show, or for anyone else except her. And that's the reason why it struck so deeply on special forces. Because she spoke not for entertainment, not to sensationalize, but to finally touch upon reality. Immediately after having confronted her dad, Mykelti noticed shifts, not only within herself but in the ways her siblings interacted with her. She said it was as if in quiet acknowledgement there was a passing among them, an unsaid understanding that everything they had been feeling was valid. She said, "I realized I wasn't alone in this, and neither were they. We all carried pieces of the same hurt, just in different ways." Some of the siblings had begun cutting Kody loose in small ways, avoiding conversations or big family events. Still, others remained in consistent contact, trying to keep peace or preserve appearances. When Mykelti finally articulated what they had all felt, it gave them permission to speak up too. She described a conversation she had with one of her sisters. We talked for hours, not about who was wrong or right, but about how we felt, how we were shaped, and what we still hope for in our relationships. And that is when it became clear that the pattern Kody created didn't just affect individual kids, it affected the family as a whole. Mykelti noted some relationships were strained, as siblings had been competing for validation, or attempting to avoid his favoritism themselves. It wasn't that we didn't love each other, she said. It was that we didn't know how to navigate the space he left behind. She also mentioned that some siblings expressed frustration at not feeling seen in family events or show appearances, and that others sometimes manipulated interactions to get attention from Kody. The truth, she said, was uncomfortable but necessary. Then she hit on something critical. Once we started being honest with each other, we realized the relationships weren't broken because of personality clashes. They were broken because of him. That, she underlined, was at once liberating and painful. It allowed them to start building bridges based on honesty rather than trying to perform for their dad's approval. That is, however, not something every sibling is ready for. Some still clung to Kody as a perfect father figure. Others, like Mykelti, had to accept that their father's love was conditional and most of the time absent. That divide, she said, is still part of their daily reality. Finally, she reflected on how this dynamic shaped their approach to their own families. We're hyper, aware of what we're passing down. None of us want our children to feel like they're competing for love or attention. From there, once Mykelti started reflecting on private family experiences, she began relating them to what viewers see on Sister Wives. She was clear: cameras capture the moments, not patterns, the emotional undercurrents, the favoritism, the unspoken tensions, which shaped her childhood and adolescence. She said, the show gives people glimpses of reality, but it is curated. It doesn't show the invisible pressure, the way some kids had to perform to get attention, or the way some of us learned to disappear so we wouldn't be noticed. And that is when she started breaking down Kody's behavior on camera. She pointed out moments when he appeared loving and present, but the patterns behind the scenes told a different story. People see him joking with one child, hugging another, celebrating milestones. But those interactions aren't consistent, they're selective. And as a kid, you feel the imbalance before anyone else notices. She went on to explain how the show sometimes amplifies these moments for dramatic effect, while downplaying the emotional consequences. The smiling family dinner, for example, might hide the tension where one sibling felt excluded or unseen. She called it a kind of emotional theater where appearances matter more than reality. Then she made a point that hit hard for anyone who has followed the family closely. Kody's role as a father on television doesn't match his role in private life. And the things that hurt the most aren't the things people see. They're the quiet absences, the favoritism. The subtle ways you learn your worth depends on how much you can please him. She gave one example, a birthday party, for a younger sibling where she and a few others didn't get as much attention as the favorite children. To viewers, it looked like a joyful family event. To Mykelti, it reinforced a long-standing dynamic of inequality. It is like the show provides cover for behaviors that otherwise would have been called out immediately, she said. Then she admitted something even deeper. The show made it harder to confront her father, because it is always public. You second-guess yourself, you wonder if your feelings are valid, or if you are just being dramatic for television. It was the special forces that gave me a space where I could speak freely without cameras or scripts. And that freedom, she said, led to the revelations we've been talking about. The realization of how patterns of favoritism, neglect, and conditional love shaped not just her, but her siblings too. Once Mykelti did shift the conversation to her father as an adult, she didn't hold back. She explained that what the fans see in Sister Wives is only part of the story. Behind the cameras, Kody's behavior reflects one consistent need for control and a careful management of his image, sometimes at the cost of his children's emotional well-being, she said. As an adult, he's not just a father, he's a performer, and sometimes those roles conflict. Being seen as a perfect dad or a loving husband matters more than actually being one. Mykelti gave examples of situations where his need to appear composed or in control outweighed authentic emotional connection. Celebrations, family events, even casual interactions could be filtered through that lens. And when a child didn't conform to the role he expected, whether by being independent, critical, or just ordinary, he distanced himself. "It's subtle," she said. "Not outright cruel, but controlling. You learn quickly which version of yourself will make him happy, and which will push him away." She also analyzed how Kody's image management went even beyond just family events. Interactions on the show, public appearances, even the private conversations were all measured, calculated, and at times performative. And such performativity, she argued, has real-life consequences. We internalize that his love is conditional, that it comes and goes depending on whether we're reinforcing the story he wants to tell about himself. Mykelti is similar to other women in that she admitted it hurt to recognize this pattern, and yet, somehow it helped her understand her siblings. It explained why some would stay close and others distanced. It explained old arguments, unspoken resentments, and even the ways they learned to adapt in order to survive emotionally. She also analyzed how Kody's control affected his marriage to Robin. As the show often frames their relationship as one of love and collaboration, Mykelti insinuated that much of what viewers witness is actually contrived in order to maintain his image. Conflicts, disappointments, or favoritism are only slightly expressed and often reframed. "The same way he manages us, he manages the narrative," she says. "It is all part of keeping everything neat for the cameras and for himself." And with that comes a very important point she made on special forces. When it comes to being a father, Kody's absence or inconsistent attention wasn't the only issue. Rather, it is dealing with someone with a controlling agenda to frame reality. After breaking down Kody's behavior and control, Mykelti talked about what it actually meant for her emotionally and for her siblings. This is the part that rarely gets discussed on the show but is vital to the long-term impact of growing up under a father whose love often felt conditional. You learn very young that love is transactional, that to get attention, approval, or affection from them, you have to earn it. You have to perform, she said. This wasn't just about feeling ignored. It shaped how she navigated friendships, relationships, and even her career. Mykelti said that as a child, she was constantly on guard, adjusting her personality to fit what she thought her father would approve of. Some of us became people pleasers, some became withdrawn, some became assertive, trying to carve out a space where we couldn't be overlooked. It affected all of us differently. She also touched on how favoritism created rifts. Certain siblings were openly closer to Kody, while others learned early to step back. That disparity led to tension, jealousy, and in some cases resentment that lasted for years. "We weren't just competing for his attention," she explained. "We were learning how to navigate his emotional availability, which was inconsistent at best." Then came the piece she admitted was toughest to articulate, how this impacted trust. Because Kody's approval was selective and conditional, it was hard for any of them to trust his intentions. They learned to second-guess, overthink, and sometimes distance themselves to protect their own feelings. "It's not that we didn't love him," she said. "We did. But we also learned that our emotional needs can't always rely on him." That's a hard lesson for a child to carry into adulthood. Lastly, she spoke to how this impacted her own parenting. She is acutely aware of the patterns she inherited and is determined not to replicate them. "I try to give my children unconditional love. I want them to know they don't have to earn it or perform for it." That lesson comes directly from the gaps I experienced growing up. Her honesty was raw, but it was also instructive. It allowed viewers to see that the consequences of conditional love aren't just emotional, they ripple across generations. After laying bare the emotional fallout, Mykelti turned her attention to Sister Wives itself. She explained that the show often highlights moments of joy, conflict, or spectacle, but rarely shows the subtler, ongoing dynamics that have shaped her family for decades. She said, "The cameras capture highlights, but they don't capture patterns. They don't capture favoritism, the emotional strain, or the unspoken rules that governs how we interact." Mykelti highlighted specific examples where Kody's public behavior reinforced what fans see as quirks or drama, but in reality, it was part of a consistent pattern of control and image management. "On the surface, he is joking, smiling, and affectionate," she explained. "But behind the scenes, he is selective. He is strategic about when and how he engages, and it affects everyone." She emphasized that this isn't about being critical for the sake of entertainment. It is about showing the truth of how family dynamics are shaped by parental behavior. I want people to understand that what seems like casual favoritism or playful manipulation is actually formative. It shapes trust, confidence, and relationships. Mykelti also discussed how production can sometimes amplify or obscure these patterns. Moments of favoritism might be edited for humor, while moments of neglect or emotional absence are minimized or removed. The narrative becomes simplified, making Kody appear more balanced than he actually is. The show can mask the complexity, she said. But that complexity exists and it matters. She described her own experience navigating the show's demands while remaining honest. Participating in reality television didn't change her relationship with Kody. It only made the emotional landscape more visible to fans who could read between the lines. Finally, she stressed that recognizing these dynamics doesn't mean resentment or blame. It is about understanding, acknowledging, and learning from them. I am not trying to villainize him. I am trying to show the truth of what it feels like to grow up in this family and how it shaped us all. After revealing the patterns, the emotional fallout, and how the show portrays it, Mykelti shifted to the broader lessons she hopes viewers take away. This wasn't about drama or sensationalism, it was about reflection, growth, and awareness. She started by talking about general family dynamics. Every family has its challenges, but what is important is seeing how behavior, especially from your parents, shapes the way you see yourself and the world. She emphasized that conditional love, favoritism, and selective attention leave their mark. Some children internalize this as failure. Others become overachievers or perfectionists. There are some who retreat and avoid conflict altogether. She shared that understanding these patterns can help people break cycles in their own families. It is not about blaming your parents, she said. It is about understanding how certain behaviors affected you so you can make conscious choices moving forward. Then it got personal. For me, realizing these truths gave me freedom. Freedom to stop defending what doesn't need defending. Freedom to set boundaries, freedom to parent differently than I was parented. She also touched on sibling relationships. According to her, one can heal old wounds by accepting the past dynamics. Talking honestly with my siblings allowed us to understand each other better. We realized the conflicts weren't personal. They were responses to the same patterns we all grew up under. Finally, she spoke of the courage it took to speak up publicly. It is scary to put your truth out there, especially when it involves someone you love. But speaking honestly is the only way to reclaim your voice and empower others to do the same. Her message wasn't just about Kody or the Brown family. It was about any viewer who has lived with conditional love, favoritism, or the emotional absence of a loved one. Recognizing it is the first step toward breaking free from its long-term effects. In her final moments on Special Forces, Mykelti reflected on everything she'd shared thus far. The childhood patterns, the favoritism, the emotional fallout, and the lessons she has learned. This was where she let the audience in completely, giving a clear picture of how her past shaped her present. She said, "I've spent years trying to make sense of my childhood, trying to defend my father, trying to explain it to myself, and now I finally understand. Understanding doesn't mean blind forgiveness, and it doesn't erase the pain. But it does mean I can move forward." She added that the journey wasn't about pointing fingers or creating drama. It was about truth, acknowledgement, and healing. Speaking my truth allows me to reclaim my life, my relationships, and my voice. It's not easy, and it's not clean. But it's necessary. She, too, spoke of her complex relationship with Kody. "I still love my father. I still hope for connection in ways that feel genuine, but I no longer define my worth by his attention or approval." That's a freedom I didn't have before. Mykelti then tied her story back into the broader audience, making it clear that her experience carries lessons for anyone who has grown up in a family where love felt conditional. If there is one thing that I want viewers to take away, it is this: your value isn't determined by how someone else treats you. Even if that someone is a parent, recognize the patterns, set boundaries, and choose what kind of relationships you want to have in your life. Finally, she reflected on the power of speaking openly on a platform like Special Forces. "Being here, sharing this story, it's bigger than me. It is creating space for others to acknowledge their experiences, feel validated, and find the courage to be truthful. That's the real impact of telling the truth. The episode closed on a note of clarity and empowerment. Mykelti did not offer a perfect resolution. There was not one. But she did offer something far more valuable: honesty, self-awareness, and hope for healing. To the audience, this is a raw, unfiltered look behind the polished reality of the Brown family. To see what human consequences there are in conditional love, favoritism, selective attention, and most importantly, an example of reclaiming one's narrative. This concludes the full narrative arc, using your competitor's same storytelling approach: personal reflection, theory, based analysis, and detailed examples, mixed with emotive and observational commentary.